Hello, I'm Ritsika and I'm one of the public programs coordinators at MAP. Thank you all for joining us this evening, and I'm pleased to welcome you to this evening talk by Anirudh Kanisetti on his new book, Lords of Earth and Sea, A History of the Chola Empire. Anirudh Kanisetti is a historian specializing in ancient and early medieval India and the author of The Lords of the Deccan. He is a recipient of the Sahitya Academy Yuva Puraskar, the Ramnath Goenka Sahitya Samman, and the Tata Literature Live a Non-Fiction Book of the Year award. He also hosts the podcast Echoes of India and Yuddha, the Indian Military History podcast. Anirudh's work today will bring light to the lives of not only the rulers of the Chola Empire, but also the everyday people who shaped and lived through this era. Using inscriptions and historical records, he separates facts from legend, offering a nuanced view of this influential dynasty. This book was made possible through a research grant provided to the author by the MAP Academy. The MAP Academy develops and provides open access resources on the art and the cultural histories of South Asia. The digital offerings include an encyclopedia of art, online courses, and several grants and special projects, encouraging greater engagement with the region's visual arts. A house rule before we start. If you wish to use the washrooms, they're right, like outside on your right, and we also provide water over there. Another thing is, please keep your phones on silent so that everyone can enjoy the show. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce Anirudh and invite him to the stage to start his talk. All the best.
Thank you all for coming here on this lovely spring evening. It's such a pleasure to see practically a full house. So many years ago when I was walking down Church Street and plotting and preparing to write my first ever history books, neither did MAP exist nor did my career as a writer. So it is such a pleasure to be in this extraordinary space. Thank you, Abhishek. Thank you for your generous championship of this book. And thank you to the rest of the MAP team for bringing me here. It's such a pleasure. So without any further ado, let's talk a little bit about the Lords of Earth and Sea. If we could actually have that image back on screen for just a little bit, because I'd like to point you to some interesting features about the little people depicted adoring that Shivalinga. Could we have that up, please? I guess we're moving on. Okay. So the image that you see, as some of the more generous of you may know, is the cover of the book. This is our reconstruction of a Chola period Sengol. The Sengol must be familiar to many of you from recent news cycles. But we wanted to imagine what Chola period jewelry would look like because we have so few surviving examples of it. We conduct an extensive study of Chola period bronze sculpture as well as stone sculpture. So this beautiful little image that you see of Makaras consuming these fighting warriors actually comes from the Brihadishwara temple at Tanjore. And I just thought that it expressed the idea of Lords of the Seas so perfectly that I wanted to make sure it was included. But more generally, the reason why I've chosen to dwell a little bit on this particular image is because what we've tried to do through this book is take generations of specialized scholarship on the Cholas, whether it's epigraphical, art historical, or literary, and weave it together into a world that was as colorful and clamorous as our own and really bring it to life for a 21st century audience. Let's go to the next slide, please. If I can get this too. Okay. Sorry. Could we have the next slide? So I think we're having some tech issues. That's okay. It's still not working. Oh, okay. All right, so what you see here is an image of the Chola world in the 9th century, and you'll immediately notice that we've done something different with the maps here. Generally speaking, when we think of maps, we think of essentially a jigsaw puzzle of nation states that are all interconnected. We think of countries as these monolithic entities which have a clear boundary between each other. But this was not really the case for medieval polities. You will see that the way that we've chosen to depict these polities is as these mosaics of different areas of royal control, because it's important for us to remember that medieval states were not modern states. Just as a prime minister cannot lift a finger and give an order and have armies rise out of the earth to follow his every command, medieval kings had to earn the consent of their subjects. And with this in mind, we can come up with very interesting understandings of how the Chola state functioned and how exactly they became these continental superstars. What you're seeing here is the earliest stage of the expansion of the Chola kingdom. You can see that the heartland of the kingdom is really along the Kaveri river. So this really dark area here is where the earliest stage of Chola expansion was. This broader area, which extends into the areas around present-day Tiruvannamalai, was called Naduvel Nadu, the country between countries. And all the way up here, this is the area around Kanchipuram, Mahabalipuram, which was the seat of the old Pallava kingdom. So the Cholas are emerging into a world that's already rich and dense, where many kingdoms have risen and fallen. And as they begin their ascent, they absorb ideas and play with many different ways of being kings. What you will also notice is that within the broader Chola territory, while you have a single core that belongs to the Cholas, you also have another very important little dynasty in the area around present-day Pudukkottai district called the Irukkuvels. And of course, you have the terrible rivals of the Cholas, the Pandyas of Madurai, the Cheras of Mahadayapuram, which is present-day Kodungalur, and closer to home, the Gangas of Talakad. But you'd be interested to know that the Gangas also had a significant presence a little north of Bangalore in this little place called Manne. Let's have the next slide, please. Yeah? Oh, yeah. Here we go. I think you'll have to pardon the comedic antics that will ensue from trying to get the right slide. So let's talk a little bit about temples. A very big part of the outcomes of this book was developing architectural drawings of various shrines from this period. And these are some of the most beautiful early Chola period shrines. But interestingly enough, you'll see that the more elaborate looking one, this one here, the Mover Koil at present-day Kodumbalur, is not actually a Chola shrine. It was built by the Irukkuvels, who are a family that were closely intermarried with the Cholas. The Chola period shrine that you see here is a Nageshwara temple at present-day Kumbakonam. And while they might look very similar at first, I want you to look at this very particular detail. You see this here, this band of lotus petals that seems like it's gently falling, right? And you see this other band here with these tiny lions that are carved, right? Now, when you look at a Chola temple, you'll see that the Chola temples actually has a completely blank plinth. It's just these simple geometric moldings. Now, keep this in mind. Let's go to the next slide, please. So here are two temples, once again from the Kaveri area. This is the temple that we saw illustrated on the left here. This is the Mover Koil at Kodumbalur. Once again, you can see very clearly this beautiful band of carved lions and this band of lotus petals falling softly to the ground. Now, this temple was built by an Irukkuvel princess. That makes sense, right? It seems to be in a family style. But the interesting thing is that this lady was a daughter-in-law of the Cholas. You would think that when a woman enters her marital family, that she would be building temples in a marital family style. But instead, here you're seeing the opposite. Here is this princess who, even after marrying into the Chola clan, is building temples in her own family style. So what does this tell us about medieval women? I think there's a tendency when you look at contemporary media about medieval India to think of queens as just sitting around in the harem, playing cards and waiting for the king to come and give them attention. But when you look at the Chola inscriptions, you will see quite remarkably that when the Chola kings married, they married into already affluent families. And so the women who are entering the Chola family as daughters-in-law, as mothers-in-law, are intelligent, educated, and wealthy. And as a result, when they're coming to the Chola palace, they are coming with their own political agendas. This princess is trying to build a temple in her family style within Chola territory on the banks of the Kaveri, so it will be visible. Her family's generosity, her family's power will be visible to audiences in the Kaveri area. And so you suddenly, through just by looking at women's architecture, women's patronage, you have a sense of a world that is not just about what the king wants, but rather a court that is made of many, many different people with many, many different agendas trying to innovate and do different things. Let's move to the next slide, please. Now, here's a different temple, and you will see that it has some similarities with this one here, right? You can see the band of carved lions. Yeah, you can see it here. The lions. Yeah, see the lions, yeah? And you see the lotus petals? Yeah, so any guesses as to which family may have built this? Iroquois? Yeah, the Cholas? Well, interesting guesses. But it was not built by either Iroquois or a Chalukya princess. It was built by the mother-in-law of this lady who built this temple. So here is a lady who has come from yet another family. She's not an Iroquois, she's not a Chola, but she's in the Chola court. And when she sees her daughter-in-law building a temple in a particular style, she finds it interesting enough that she picks up some elements of it and integrates that into her own temple. And then very interestingly, this feature is not present in any other Chola temple of this period that I'm aware of. You have here dancing women and women musicians playing the drums, playing the flute, and so on. So what's happening here? Maybe this queen is doing something in her family's architectural style, or maybe she's a patron of the arts. Maybe she likes music herself and she's choosing to have these depicted. So once you really look more carefully at these seemingly pointlessly ornate structures, you begin to see stories and minds, individuals trying to express personalities through them. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now, I want to continue this discussion about queens by talking about a lady who I believe in the most real sense is the true founder of the Chola Empire. And this is a lady called Sembian Mahadevi. And I've chosen this image even though Sembian herself is not present in the actual sculpture. You can see her in this inscription. Now, let me just summarize the inscription for you. It says something on the lines of, "Hail prosperity. This is the glorious King Gandaraditya, who is now deceased, who is worshipping a Shivalinga. Behind him is the glorious King Uttama Chola." You can see him here holding the royal parasol. And the patron of this glorious image is the glorious Queen Sembian Mahadevi. Now, deceptively simple. On the surface of it is just the queen talking about how devout she is, how devout her family is. But once you begin to, just keep in mind, these are people who had politics, who are doing things partially out of devotion, but not purely out of devotion. The political context within which this image was made is very important. In the 970s, when King Uttama Chola was crowned, his succession was disputed. So his mother, Sembian Mahadevi, begins to build temples. This is the very first temple that she built. It's at Koneri Rajapuram, which my friend Anand and I visited during our field work for this trip, for this book. And this is right in the backyard of the Cholas. When Sembian Mahadevi builds this temple, she also buys up some land. She renames the land the glorious Gandaraditya flower garden, and she donates it to the local Brahmin assembly. Now, all of this certainly very pious, nice, but when you begin to see the broader pattern of Sembian Mahadevi's activities, you begin to see something very interesting. Let's go to the next slide, please. So while earlier Chola queens only built one temple over the course of their lifetimes, Sembian Mahadevi, as Dowager Queen, built 12 temples. And in some cases, she made gifts to multiple temples. And if you were to look at the spread of her gifts, does it remind you of a map that we saw earlier today? Does it remind you of the map of the Chola kingdom? Does the density of her temples not remind you of the mosaic of the Chola state? You can see that the core of the kingdom has now shifted and it has steadily moved from the west, deeper and deeper east. It has moved into the fertile Kaveri delta, right? You can see she's made a whole bunch of gifts. The yellow thumbtacks are the temples that she built, and the blue thumbtacks are the gifts that she made. So you can see there's a whole bunch of them right here in this fertile deltaic region where she has bought up land and she's made gifts to encourage cultivation and then donated these lands to these temples. And she's also then essentially deploying her temples like a general deploying the vanguard of his armies. Wherever the Cholas want to make their presence felt, Sembian Mahadevi is building a temple. So she does it here in Naduvil Nadu, the country between countries, and then she does it all the way up here. This is near present-day Chennai. So she's demarcating this vast, spread out state. And when you look at where she chooses to build her temples, they're usually in places that have been sung about by various Shaivite saints. So these are places that are already popular. These are places where pilgrims are going to be coming and seeing the queen's generosity. These are also, she also chooses in some cases market centers to build temples in. So she knows that crowds of people, that merchants are going to come and see her temples and then take word of her generosity elsewhere. So this little diagram I've put up here is an indication of how this early Chola state is functioning. Sembian Mahadevi builds a temple. In this temple, she has a message that says, oh, you know, the glorious queen Sembian Mahadevi, the wife of the glorious king Gandharaditya, built this glorious temple. And what she's doing is disseminating the charisma of the state. She's depicting the Chola king as the foremost devotee of Shiva. So instead of relying on a whole bunch of smaller families like the Irukkuvales, now the Chola king is directly connecting to his subjects. The Chola king is directly making gifts to local temples. He's giving gifts to village assemblies. He's asking village assemblies to administer his gifts. And keep in mind, this is a time when temples are emerging as community centers. The great and good of local communities go to temples to transact business. And in these temples, they would see carved in stone in these very visible markers of the Cholas taking a direct interest in the affairs of locals. So what happens? Local loyalties are won. People are more inclined to pay taxes to the Chola state. And so they're able to build more and more temples. So what you have here is essentially a very rudimentary form of a media strategy. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now, while the inscriptions themselves are very important and very interesting, and you can see here that Sembian Mahadevi is not building her temples in her family style. She's building them in the Chola style. Remember what I was telling you about the way they do their foundations? So you have these very simple geometric moldings, and they're not as pretty as lions and lotus petals, but they're very practical and they're very useful for one thing, which is inscriptions. So a Chola temple is able to act as a living record of not just the dynasty's generosity to a local community, but also the local community's accepting of that generosity and their additions that are made to the temple. So quite remarkably, you will see in Tamil Nadu that the walls of these temples gradually become covered in inscriptions, which gives us a very detailed record year by year of the way that the Chola state is functioning and expanding. And leaving aside the inscriptional aspect of it, Sembian Mahadevi also does something that is integral to any good media strategy, and that is good visuals. This great god that you see here, any guesses who that is? Yeah, of course. This is the first depiction of Nataraja in a large-scale stone sculpture ever seen in the Kaveri floodplain. Nataraja is a god of... Yes? Where is he from? Chidambaram. Where is Chidambaram? It's a swamp, yes. It's a swampy region that is not near the Kaveri floodplain. Chidambaram, in the earliest texts, is quite distant from the agrarian activities and the humdrum daily rhythm of the Kaveri floodplain. This is in Koniri Rajapuram, Tirunellam, so very close to Padayarai. So this is in the heartland of the Chola kingdom. Suddenly, this great god of the swamp is being depicted in a large-scale stone sculpture in the Kaveri floodplain. Why is this? I think it's because, yes, Sembian Mahadevi was, of course, devoted to the god. We know that her husband, Gandharaditya, wrote poems about the beauty of the god. But I think it's also because Sembian Mahadevi was able to associate the god powerfully with the Cholas. So powerfully that, remember what I was saying a little earlier about her building temples in market centers? We have some very interesting cases where merchants started a temple renovation and they paused it in the middle to add in a Nataraja sculpture. So that, I think, is a very clear indication of the increasing charisma, the acceptance, and the growing loyalty that the average Tamil elite has to the Chola state. Let's move to the next slide, please. Okay, now all of a sudden, something dramatically changes. In 985 CE, when a young prince called Arulmozhivarman takes the throne. And all of a sudden, from this really, and keep in mind how small the Chola state was when we began this lecture, right? It was something about like maybe this large, this whole area was super diffuse. All of a sudden, in the space of barely 20 or 30 years, you begin to see Rajaraja Chola's inscriptions appearing across this huge swathe of territory. This is not limited to the boundaries of present-day Tamil Nadu. It's also expanding deep into South Karnataka. It's also expanding into northern Sri Lanka, and a very significant and long-lasting Chola outpost is established in the deep southern part of India, and their influence is extended all the way up the east coast. Now let me give you another way of visualizing this dramatic expansion of scale. Let's go to the next slide, please. So this is where we began. This is the kind of temples we saw at the beginning of the Chola ascent, right? About, let's say, twice or thrice the height of a person, right? Next slide, please. This is what they achieved in 30 years. This is what Rajaraja Chola achieves in 30 years. They go from building these beautiful little shrines to these colossal temples, 40 times the size of anything that they had built before. How was this possible? Next slide, please. So to understand this, these illustrations all came from the Map Academy grant. But what you're seeing here is, for the first time ever, a reconstruction of what the Brihadishwara temple at Tanjore may have looked like in its heyday. And what we've done is we've done an isometric cutaway. So we've taken a whole section of the temple and extracted it. So you can see what the architecture is like inside. Now, I'd like to particularly direct your attention, next slide please, to a couple of things. The first is this band of lions that have now been picked up and become a standard part of Chola temples. It's no longer restricted to the Irukku but also this massive band of inscriptions that goes all the way around the temple. And what's on these inscriptions? Next slide, please. This is the edict of King of Kings, Lion among kings, to be cherished by the multitude of the diadems of the crowd of all princes. And here he has this whole list of reasons why he is a legitimate emperor. He is a great conqueror. He has conquered 7 different countries. And here's the most interesting line to me. He deprived the Pandyas of their splendor while he was resplendent to such a degree that he was worthy to be worshipped everywhere. Next slide, please. So, what is happening in this temple? We know from this massive archive of inscriptions that Rajaraja Chola, with the military conquests that he was able to undertake, funnels vast quantities of wealth into this colossal imperial shrine. What you're seeing here is a reconstruction of Chola bureaucrats. For the very first time, we have a sense of a large and organized revenue apparatus. We actually have paintings from within the temple that show us what these bureaucrats look like. And very interestingly, they had these lovely, colorful coats that you can still see fragments of in the murals. And we know that senior bureaucrats had the really long and colorful coats, but the junior bureaucrats had to wear white short-sleeved pants instead, or really lungis to be precise. We also know that Rajaraja collected large numbers of Shaivite devotees to sing the praises of the god and endowed his temple with them. And finally, you can see the man himself here making gifts to the great god. Let's go to the next slide, please. And when you look at the iconography of the temple, so keep in mind we just extracted a whole chunk of the temple so you can see what's happening inside. So here is the linga being worshipped. We also have paintings along this whole circumambulatory corridor. And on the exterior, you have all these depictions of the god Shiva. And very interestingly, keep in mind what Sembian Mahadevi is doing, right? She takes this particular form of Shiva, Nataraja, and associates the Cholas with him through their devotion. What's happening here in the top rung of this temple is Rajaraja commissions all these sculptures of Shiva as Tripurantaka. Any guesses who Tripurantaka is? He's Shiva, the destroyer of the 3 demon cities. So it seems that Rajaraja had a particular affinity with this form of the god. And what he is trying to do to this colossus, keep in mind, there was no, up till this point, there had never been a 2-story temple in Tamil Nadu. This is the first time that a Tamil king had been able to conceive of a plan of this scale. What Rajaraja is trying to do is he's trying to create essentially an imperial religion that is focused on his imperial temple. And the gifts that he's giving to it are not just used to worship the god. We know from inscriptions that he's actually using the temple as this colossal engine of economic control. The wealth that goes into the temple is reinvested. It's invested in expanding agriculture. We know that thousands of animals were gifted to the temple, but the animals are not kept in the temple premises. They were sent to shepherds in the furthest reaches of his country. So what he's trying to do is, let's go to the next slide and you will see it all a little more clearly. The next slide, please. What he's trying to do is he has taken Sembian Mahadevi's simple model of state and he's added one very, very important aspect to it, which is conquest. Sembian Mahadevi and her son are not military people. They're peaceful, they tend to exhibit they tend to project charisma through temple patronage. But what Rajaraja does is, when he builds a temple, he includes this long list of reasons why he should be followed because he's a glorious conqueror. And what that does is that not only does he get tax revenues, but he also gets military men to join him. And what he does with these military men is he takes them out on campaigns of conquest. As he conquers, he gains wealth. With the wealth, he's able to build more temples. While Sembian Mahadevi, keep in mind, the earliest Chola queens built 1 temple. Sembian Mahadevi built 12 temples. How many do you think Rajaraja Chola built? Yes. Very good guess, yes. So he built 5 times as many as Sembian Mahadevi. So essentially what is created is this ever-expanding feedback loop, this state that is able to mobilize manpower and resource at a scale that had never been imagined before. This colossal imperial temple that we saw, this huge superstructure, this hollow pyramid, consisted of 49,000 tons of granite. Guess how long it took for them to assemble that much? I know I'm asking you guys a lot of questions. Guess how many years it took to assemble all of that? 7 years? Somebody has read the book already. Well done, sir. Well done. So that's 7,000 tons of stone that are being assembled every year, while also sending out armies of tens of thousands of men on conquest. And we know that conquests were happening because the inscriptions tell us year by year where Rajaraja is going and which places were being conquered. So you have essentially, with the extraordinary corpus of Chola inscriptions, the sense of a state that is not a static entity, but something that's rhythmic, that's expanding, that's flowing almost tidally across vast swathes of South India and gathering wealth and funneling them into this colossal temple, and in turn reinvesting those proceeds across a huge swathe of South India. What we are seeing is the creation of South India's first and only coastal empire. There had never been an empire like this at any point in Indian history. All the great empires that we've heard of, name a famous Indian empire. Mauryas, okay? Huh? Okay. You're all giving me examples of river valley empires. You're telling me even the Chalukyas, these are all empires that controlled. Okay, so very smart people in the audience. But yes, all of the really great and powerful empires are based in the river valleys. We're talking about the Ganga Yamuna Valley, or we're talking about the Krishna Godavari Valley. Or the Palas also, once again in the big deltaic region. The Cholas are the first to really consolidate a huge chunk of India's coast. Next slide, please. So, here we have the man himself, Rajaraja Chola. And this is one of the best preserved murals from the Brihadishwara temple. And I find it very interesting that even though Rajaraja took all this time and effort to associate himself with Tripurantaka, here he's actually depicted adoring Nataraja. So Nataraja, the god of this wild swamp, has now taken a seat at the heart of the Chola kingdom as the greatest god of the Chola polity. Over the course of the 300 years while the empire exists, over 3,000 Nataraja bronzes are produced. And in the 19th century, when European collectors arrive in South India, it is these bronzes that they pick up, disseminate to Indologists like Ananda Kumaraswamy, to sculptors like Rodin, and eventually that is how the god of this queen that most of us have never heard of becomes the most iconic symbol of Hinduism today. But that's a whole other tangent. Let's continue. Next slide, please. Now, while Rajaraja is very interesting, I'm much more interested in the little people that you see depicted here. These are the people of the Velam, or the service retinue. We know it was a very important part of the Chola palace. And we really have to think, right, when we think about medieval war, it's not just a question of armies of muscular guys running at each other across a battlefield. War is, if you ask any military historian, they will tell you, war is extremely boring. Wars are won because of logistics, because of resources, because of manpower. The states that have the best logistical systems are able to have the most successful armies. But when armies go out and conquer, they are not conquering in some kind of vacuum. They are changing societies. They are displacing peoples. They are bringing new peoples to places where they weren't before. And when you think about it, it's kind of intuitive. We live in a world that is shaped by the aftermath of World War II. If not for the First and Second World Wars, our world would look completely different. Yet when we think about medieval wars, we think of them as happening in, it's just an abstract concept. But what I'm very interested in is this idea of how did war change societies? How did war make polities? And how did this affect the little people? The people that you see here, here of course you can see a few royal bodyguards with some very dashing mustaches. You can see I've taken quite a lot of inspiration from them. And these nice little pearl necklaces. But these ladies are the most interesting to me because we know that the Chola court organized these women who were brought in through war into large service retinues associated with particular royals. So we know that like particular Chola kings had, for example, the select Pandya service retinue of the sacred bath. So the king was ceremonially bathed by captured women. And the idea was that these women represented the desire of the earth for the king. Keep in mind that inscription I showed you a little earlier, where Rajaraja says that he rejoiced that the goddesses of the great earth and of fortune had become his companions. I know it's very strange to us because we tend to think of kings as these elevated and noble people, and I'm sure some of them were, but the nature of power is that power very often is based on violence. And the interesting thing about medieval kings is, why do we think that they would conform to our moral standards? If we want to understand these medieval people, it's important we understand every aspect of them, understand the societies that they were a part of, and the fact that these societies, while they had many powerful and remarkable women, also could, in some cases, be exploitative. Let's move on to the next slide, please. Now, what really was the nature of Chola conquest? Now, of course, politicians will tell you one thing, but they don't always execute it. And the very interesting thing is, when it comes to the Cholas in Sri Lanka, Rajaraja Chola claims that he conquered Lanka, which was protected by the fierce Sinhalas, who were famed in all the 8 directions. And he claims that he destroyed Anuradhapura. If you look at the Sri Lankan chronicles, especially the Chola Vamsa also claims that not only the Cholas destroyed Anuradhapura, but that they broke open the stupas and extracted all the wealth within. But that's not really what the stupa looks like. It doesn't look like it's been broken apart, extracted. I spoke to an archaeologist who excavated Anuradhapura, and he told me there's no evidence of large-scale violence or destruction in the ruins of the city. So take everything I'm telling you with a little bit of salt. We have literary claims of all these great and terrible transformations, but maybe what we're seeing is a much more complex process of social and political churn, where kings are telling us one thing, but there's no guarantee that's what actually happened. Until we do the archaeology, we'll never really know the truth of what happened in medieval India, but that's what makes it so interesting to me, is that this tendency of power to tell many stories to many different people is eerily modern. This inability to really know what happened, but for the great and the powerful to say that they did a particular thing, it makes you think of medieval people not just as these folks who existed to give us some great lesson about how a king built mango trees on both sides of the road, but complicated people with their own political agendas and audiences of their time that we don't really have a very good understanding of today. Next slide, please. Now, I'm aware that I'm probably getting myself in a lot of trouble with all these big questions about medieval India. So let's move away to something a little less controversial. I'd like to talk about the Chola expedition to Southeast Asia. It all begins, as far as we can tell, with a seemingly innocuous embassy that Rajaraja Chola sends to China in the year 1013. It arrives in 1015, by which time he's dead, but the ambassadors don't know that. And what the ambassadors do is they give gifts to the Chinese emperor. They give gifts of 844 kilograms of pearls, 60 elephant tusks, 38 kilograms of frankincense, and a robe and a cap embroidered with pearls. Now, where do you think that the frankincense came from? West Asia? Leah, you need to stop answering questions. You know all the answers already. Any other guesses? Yemen? Yeah, that's okay. Yemen. Yemen is a very good guess, and that's most likely where he got it from. What about the pearls? Sri Lanka. Yeah. So, do you think the Sri Lankans gave him the pearls voluntarily? Yeah. Well, but here's the interesting thing. The merchant ambassador also gave gifts on his own account, and the Chinese sources actually tell us there's a court record that says that the ambassador presented all this on behalf of Rajaraja, and then he presented on his own account 264 kilograms of pearls. Why was this? Now, the Sri Lankan Chronicle, keeping in mind how unreliable it is, tells us something else that's very interesting. They say that before Rajaraja invaded Anuradhapura, a Tamil horse merchant gave him this tip-off to come and conquer the island. And now you have a situation where merchants are extracting pearls and making gifts to the Chinese ambassador. So, I'll stop beating around the bush and I'll tell you exactly what I think. I think that the Tamil merchants are one of the great unsung forces and movers of medieval Indian history. When you start to connect the dots, when you start to accept the idea that kings were not the sole makers of the past, you begin to see a much more complicated society where many people have power and many people are doing many different things. And the reason why I put two images here, the Chinese emperor, but also the Empress Liu, is because I found myself asking what happened to these pearls that the ambassador gifted. And once again, it's one of these cases where the answer, I think, has been staring us in the face all along. Look at her headdress. Where did these pearls come from? I think they may have come from this embassy of the Cholas. Next slide, please. Now, before we talk about the expedition to Southeast Asia, we have to talk about the great expedition to the Ganga, which Rajaraja's heir, Rajendra Chola, executed in about 1022, 1023. And you can see that by this time, the Chola state is no longer the sole superpower of South India. Something else has risen to challenge it, and that is the empire of the Western Chalukyas in the Deccan. And we have a series of detailed inscriptions that talk about essentially this seasonal cycle of campaigns where once the rice seeds have been planted, you have armies gathering and then going to war. And then when the rice seeds have to be harvested, the armies once again dissipating. But season after season, these two states are clashing. But here's the thing, we talked a little bit about how the great empires are based on the river valleys. That's not just because river valleys have nice climates, it's because the river valleys have large populations. And what does this mean? Remember how I told you about how wars are boring business? Whichever side has the more manpower ends up winning. And the thing is that the Krishna Godavari Valley has a lot more manpower than the Kaveri Valley does. So it seems that at some point there's an understanding within the echelons of Chola court society that endless conquest is simply not sustainable. And so the time comes to do something grand, something that gives a statement. And I think the answer that they alight upon is this great campaign to the Ganga. But once again, when you look at the Chola inscriptions, you begin to see hints and subtext of what really happened. We think of an army of tens of thousands of men marching all the way to Bengal. But once again, think about the logistics. How feasible is it to march those many men so far away from your capital. How do you feed these guys? They're not going to be eating mud. They need to be fed. And if they need to be fed, rather than have them lug hundreds and hundreds of tons of rice with them, a more intuitive way, and you can disagree with me, but don't you think a more intuitive way to transport some really heavy stuff is to do it over water? And who goes to water very often? Merchants. Okay. Now when you look at the Chola inscriptions, you'll see that Rajendra Chola specifies that at Jajpur, he captured a king of Odisha, and he claims the conquest of a bunch of other places but doesn't give any details, which I think is significant. And then after that, he just claims that he captured a bunch of Bengali kings. Now, I think that what happened is that at some point, they take the logical next step of moving rice over water to moving troops over water. And this establishes a very important precedent. Next slide, please. Which is the campaign to Southeast Asia. Now, this image that you're seeing is a model of an Indian Ocean ship. And you'll see there's some interesting stuff about it. First of all, it doesn't look anything like the ships you see in media, like Ponniyin Selvan. The deck is actually mostly open. You have a little hut in the middle, which is where the folks who are traveling are actually staying. And the sails are very rudimentary. It's not capable of these very advanced maneuvers and navigations. But you don't need very advanced maneuvers and navigations to get across the seas. We know that from various sources that medieval Tamil navigators had dozens of names for different winds and currents. They knew at which point of year which current was going to be flowing in which direction, which wind was going to blow ships in which direction. And they had all these very simple hacks to figure out all kinds of useful maritime information. If they wanted to track time, for example, they'd take a coconut shell and they'd drill a little hole in it and they'd put it in a bucket of water. It would take exactly the same amount of time for the shell to fill up every time it was put in the bucket. So they had a way to measure time. And then they would take a moist ball of ash and they'd throw it into the water, and as the ash ball spread across time, they could figure out the speed of the ship, right? But I think the most amazing thing is the way that these guys figured out star altitudes. They had this little device called a rappalagai, and the way it works is that it's a little wooden board with a knotted cord pulled through it. And each knot corresponds to a particular star's altitude. Not very intuitive, no? This is how it works. You take the knot, you put it in your mouth, okay? You know the length of this base, right? You align the board so the star is here, right? You know this angle is 90 degrees. You have a hypotenuse here, so you can figure out this angle, right? So all you need to do is figure out when you're at a particular port what the altitude of a star is, take your little knot and tie it here. So every time the star is at that particular altitude, you know you're heading towards that particular port, right? So all you have to do is get on your ship, figure out your latitude, find the wind current that takes you to that direction, and hit the coast. It's really as simple as that. So that's how the Cholas navigated, in case any of you are wondering. Next slide, please. Next slide. I know I'm just taking my own sweet time with this. But now, here's the thing about the Southeast Asia expedition. We have all these claims by Rajendra Chola that he conquered all these dozens of different cities. But what does the archaeology tell us? You know, that's what we should really be looking at. And this here is a very interesting inscription found in Lobutua or Barus. So it's on this coast of Sumatra. And what does this inscription tell us? In such and such year, we, the 500s of 1,000 directions, known in all countries and directions, have met here in this city known as Matankari Vallava Techi Uyakonta Pattinam, the port of those beloved by the war goddess Durga. And we decided the following for our sons: the Nagara Senapati, the general of the city, and the Mavettur, which might refer to mahouts of elephants. And they say that each ship, the captain, will pay such and such tax in the form of gold based on the price of camphor before they walk on the outstretched cloth. So the outstretched cloth is literally the red carpet they're rolling out for people to enter into their shops. But they have to pay a tax based on the price of camphor, etc., etc. Where does camphor come from? We have it in most of our homes. We burn it in our altars. It was offered in medieval Tamil temples. But where does camphor come from? Any guesses? Any guesses? Okay, so you haven't reached that chapter yet, huh? Okay. It comes from Sumatra. Camphor is a forest product that comes from the rainforest of Indonesia. And here you have a Tamil merchant port. Keep in mind, they don't mention a king at all. You have a merchant port in Sumatra, in this island, that's talking about the price of camphor. And it goes further. We found evidence of another port on this side of the island called Kota China. Now, if you were to actually sail on this part of Sumatra, it would be a pretty miserable experience. It's a very swampy and difficult terrain for you to navigate your ship around, especially with the very rudimentary rudders and sails that we saw. But if you have two ports on either side, then you can move a convoy over land with elephants, right? And you can exploit the highlands where the densest rainforests with camphor are. And I know it sounds a little bit like a conspiracy theory. I can see a lot of very skeptical faces here. But what if I were to tell you that there is a culture called the Karo in the highlands of Sumatra? You can look them up. And the Karo have 200 Tamil loanwords in their vocabulary. So what does this tell us? We have this idea of states and kings being the protagonists, but here's all this other evidence of merchants being active in military expansion, in conquest, in settling places outside of India, in bringing resources that fed into the globalizing temple towns of medieval society. And we have a whole culture that has Tamil loanwords, and we still think that states and kings were the sole protagonists of the past. Next slide, please. So, what begins to change? Why does this extraordinary empire, why does this cycle slowly start to falter? Why does it break apart? Well, from the late 11th, early 12th century, as predicted, the state starts to run out of manpower. Not enough loot is coming in. There is not enough of a conviction that the king is ever victorious. And more importantly, keep in mind, when you're recruiting from the floodplains, from the rice-growing states, your cycle of campaign is tied to the cycle of harvest. So you want to have recruits who aren't tied to the cycle of harvest. You want hunter-gatherers. The hunter-gatherers of medieval India come from the hills, and you have this remarkable situation where there's this arms race between the western Chalukyas up in the Deccan and the Cholas in the Kaveri floodplain. Both of them start to recruit hill peoples and funnel them into the wars. Now, the Chola hill peoples are called the Pallis and the Surudimans. You may or may not have heard of them, but you have definitely heard of the mercenaries from the hills that the Chalukya Empire used, because they ruled a big chunk of South Karnataka, the Hoysalas. The Hoysalas call themselves Malaprol Ganda, the man among the hill chiefs. So what begins to happen? As the military campaigns begin to falter, as the gifts are insufficient, local loyalties begin to fade. And then what happens is that because you can't recruit enough people from the rice fields, you begin to recruit from the military entrepreneurs, the hill people. And the hill people now begin to have more and more wealth. And so what the Chola king used to once do with his temple campaigns, these military entrepreneurs and warlords begin to do. So you begin to see, next slide please, this extraordinary period of temple building, this explosion of temple building activity all over the Kaveri floodplain and beyond. Some of the most iconic and famous Tamil temples. Actually, name some famous Tamil temples. Any guesses? Srirangam, yes? Yes, this is Tiruvarur. This is Tiruvarur. Oh, that Tiruvannamalai is also a good guess. Tiruvannamalai, Tiruvarur, Srirangam, Kumbakonam, Tanjavur, all of these places saw sustained activity in the 12th and 13th centuries. Ironically, as the Chola state is declining, some of the largest and most impressive structures are being built, especially the Gopuram. Now, the Gopuram today is the most iconic symbol of South Indian architecture, right? But while there is one early Chola Gopuram built in Tanjore by Rajaraja Chola, most of the most famous Gopurams, Chidambaram for example, Srirangam, Tiruvarur, all of these sites have gopurams built by Chola warlords in the 12th and 13th centuries. It is at this time that because you suddenly have this influx of wealthy people who are seeking to expand older temples, the temples transform from these small shrines to having these big courtyards around them with gopurams. And then once the initial courtyard is established, how do you add more stuff to it? Build another courtyard, add more mandapas, add more structures, make gifts of bronzes, make gifts of camphor and imported fineries. And what happens when you do all of this? Temples become commercial centers. Market lanes begin to emerge. People start to settle down, and gradually urbanism starts to kick off. So it's the third urbanization of India is what it's called. The first urbanization being the Harappan civilization. Who's giving all the answers? I haven't asked you questions, so please. The second urbanization is the Gangetic plains and the Janapadas and Mahajanapadas. And the third great urbanization, which really sets up the urban pattern. If you were to look at a satellite image of Tamil Nadu even today, in the Kaveri area, all the town centers will be around 12th to 13th century temples. That's how important this period is to the shape of South India. Next slide, please. Now, I think there's a tendency when we think about the past to think about the rise of empires with this fervor. We like hearing about empires going and conquering and beating up the bad guys, but we flinch when we talk about the decline of empires, right? We don't like hearing about the fall of empires because there's something a bit disappointing about it. But I don't think we should be, because if not for the decline of the British Raj, none of us would be here today, right? And so when we talk about the decline of the Chola Empire, we're talking about the unleashing of some of the most extraordinary religious and social forces in South Indian history. We're talking about the rise of individuals like Ramanuja, depicted here, Chekkilar, the author of the Periya Puranam, and the compilation of hagiographies of the Tamil saints, the standard lists and biographies of the 63 Nayanmar, the Shaiva saints, and the worship of these saints in bronzes, the gifting of sets of these bronzes to these expanding temple complexes. So this to me is the paradox of how we think about the Cholas. To me, their decline is as interesting as their rise. While in their rise, it's the dynasty that shows you how innovative it is. In the fall of the dynasty, you see Tamil society emerging into this great confidence. And quite remarkably, this is the first place in India where we have large-scale evidence of community worship in temples. When you look at some of the earliest temples, if you have to look, anybody been to Badami? Yeah, Badami. Yes. The temples of Badami, are they suited for large crowds? No. Simply by looking at the space within a temple, you get a sense of what it was intended for. A lot of the early temples are intended to be royal centers. They're intended for the court to worship in. But what did we see in the previous slide? Previous slide, please. What is this temple intended for? It's intended for crowds. It's intended for hundreds, thousands of people. The inscriptions tell us the same thing. They're intended to feed people, to funnel large amounts of wealth, to collect large amounts of rice. So this community aspect of worship did not exist in northern India. Has anybody been to Khajuraho? Khajuraho? Yeah? A few well-traveled folks? Yes? Khajuraho's temples aren't designed for crowds either. They have very small mandapas. Every time a new individual comes to the site of Khajuraho, they build their own standalone temple, still intended for small groups of people. But here, you're seeing a very different society at play. They're not coming and adding their own temple to an already existing sacred site. They're expanding an existing temple and equipping it for larger and larger scale worship. You're seeing here the history of South Indian Hinduism. Next slide, please. Next slide. And that brings us pretty much to the end of my talk. This image that you see on your left is a temple procession in Jaffna in northern Sri Lanka, where a large Tamil diaspora settled during the Chola period. Any guesses as to what we're seeing on the right? Yes, it's the Alsur Someshwara. And what's very interesting about the Alsur Someshwara is that in a lot of ways, its architecture is very Chola inspired. Now, I realize I have missed one point of the many, many things I've been able to talk about. But one way you can really tell when a temple is Tamil inspired is that you'll see this kind of vase. Do you see this vase here, this little pot with a pillar emerging from it? That is a very Chola temple idea. What is it doing in the Someshwara temple in Alsur? And once you go inside the temple, you will see a set of stone statues of the Tamil Shaiva saints still being worshipped. The Nayanmars, nearly 1,000 years after they were first established. So in all of these deeply profound ways, it is not just the Cholas, but really the empire, this vast and vociferous and complex and raucous society that they ruled over, that continues to impact our world today. Thank you very much. You've been a great audience. The final thing I'd like to use to blow your mind, to take you a little back into the past once again. And my last question for the evening, I promise, before I let you guys ask me questions. Where is this image of Shiva from? Good guess? Okay. More guesses? Okay, we're getting warmer. More guesses? Getting colder? China, yes. This is from Chuenzhou, a port on the East China Sea. And very interestingly, this is an inscription that was actually found in relation to this temple. The great imperial Chola temples are named after the Chola emperors. So Rajarajeshwaram, Gangaikonda Choleshwaram, the Lord of Rajaraja, the Lord of Gangaikonda Chola. Here, we are being told that a Persian firman has been given to this gentleman, Sambandha Perumal, for the installation of the god Tirukanishwaram, the Lord of the Holy Khan, on the shores of China in the 13th century. I did promise to blow your mind, didn't I? Okay, on that note, let's have some questions. Yes, sir, please.
You could, yeah. I'm connecting 2 points that you mentioned. A, that within 30 years, the Chola Empire went from constructing small structures to towering temples, point number one. And point number two, the fact that they used this small innovation to compute the latitude, right? So I just want to ask you whether there have been any other records of innovation happening during this period. What led to the change in commerce, to shipbuilding, to architecture, to warfare, that led to the glory of the empire during that period?
I think that in many cases what you're seeing is that older knowledge that has been accumulated for century after century is finally finding markets and clients that are capable of paying for it. This is the sound, right? Okay, so I think what is happening is that you have architects who have some basic concepts of, okay, if the base of the temple is this large, then the height can be this much, right? And this principle is, it's a practical engineering principle that is powerful enough to build temples of any scale, but there had never been a patron who was wealthy enough to allow them to do something. There had never been a patron who was capable of mobilizing that much stone to experiment with something on this scale. And I think something similar happened with ocean-going expeditions as well, in that the knowledge existed, but that kind of patron, the kind of conqueror who had the vision and the political impulse to do something like this had not existed. And very interestingly, did not exist again. Because you don't see in later empires that they had the same urge to go and do something in Southeast Asia. So I hope that answers the question. Thank you, sir.
As a kid in school, my history teachers used to tell that we Indians never invaded any other countries. We are the nice guys. So keeping that in mind, how different is how different are imperial Cholas when compared to imperial British?
I think that empires work in similar ways, wherever in the world, whenever in the world. And to anyone who says that Indians were all peaceful and never conquered anybody, I'd say, please read Indian sources. Please read medieval Indian sources and tell me how peaceful these people were. Because again, this is not to denigrate the people of the past. That is just the way that polities worked. But I think that it is profoundly sad that our ability to see the past is so blinkered by this need for this rosy, perfect place. The past doesn't exist to fulfill our emotional needs. The past exists to challenge us the way the present does. Hope that answers the question.
Right. So I heard that the Cholas were very good in administration also, like decentralizing. So when they conquered Ganga, I read that they had officials who managed the local administration and all. Can you just elaborate how they administered the territories they occupied?
So I think what's happening once again is that the temple acts as the site where a lot of negotiations happen between the center and the local. So it is not necessarily, you see under Rajaraja Chola, for example, that he will appoint one of his officers to go and sit in the temple to look at the accounts and to make sure everything is happening as ordained by himself. But in many cases, you see that it's really the local assembly who does their own thing. They will put the name of the king and the year of the king in front of every inscription. But you really have to think, right? If a flood is coming, you aren't going to send a letter to Gangaikonda Cholapuram and wait for four months for the king to get back to you. You have to take a decision now. So I think a lot of things really happen at the local level, but the very fact that the charisma of the king, the fact that the king is considered legitimate, tells you a lot about the reach of the Chola state, about the ability of the Cholas to disseminate through temple sites their right to rule, which does not happen in a lot of medieval Indian polities, let me tell you. It is really extraordinary. In the 1020s, under Rajendra Chola, a huge swathe of South India mentions him as king and mentions his regnal year. This was not the case for most medieval Indian kings. It's truly remarkable. Thank you, sir. Ma'am.
I had the privilege of visiting Angkor Wat, also some of the Champa remains, as well as I've been to Laos, to Luang Prabang, and I've seen the influences in Thailand as well. So I would love it if you'd tell us a little bit about what happened in Southeast Asia. You've touched on it briefly, but I'm sure your book goes into more detail, but if you could elaborate a little on what exactly happened in Southeast Asia.
So, first, I enjoin all of you to read William Dalrymple's The Golden Road, which talks about this. But very briefly, I think what is happening is that across a huge swathe of the Indian Ocean, you have new kinds of polities that are emerging. And these polities need a way to present themselves. So, just as a new state today will have a prime minister, a president, and a legislature, there is a particular way of making a state seem legitimate in the medieval period, and that is to have a Sanskrit-speaking king who has a great royal temple, which associates him directly with the great Puranic epics. So I think what we are seeing is the dissemination of a concept of kingship, of a certain ritual apparatus of kingship. I don't think it's a coincidence that this idea of the Rajyabhishekam, the ceremonial bathing of the king, starts to appear in South India at the same time appears in Southeast Asia. You see kings calling themselves Varman in South India at the same time as it's happening in Southeast Asia. So, of course, there are some historians who think that it was a unidirectional flow. I'm not entirely convinced. I think that what's happening is more like a network of exchanging contemporary polities. But once again, this is one of those things that only archaeology can properly give us the answers to. And I think that these big questions can only be answered by multinational efforts to excavate. I think that if we were to go digging, we would find much more traces of Tamil diaspora. A lot of the archaeological reports I was looking at on these Tamil merchant settlements were written in the 1980s. And since then, most of these sites have deteriorated. They have disappeared under erosion. And this is a massive problem in South India and Southeast Asia. Unless we start excavating now, getting answers now, these traces of the past will be lost forever and we'll never be able to answer these questions.
Thank you.
ma'am.
Thank you very much.
Oh, one of the people in the back, please. Yes, yes, yes. I love folks in the back. Yes.
You were just mentioning about the Tamil diaspora and what they thought of their own history. But there's a lot of tainting of, Chola history and Pallava history as a modern day Tamil history. And that kind of gets warped into a kind of Tamil nationality, which is quite apparent in Sri Lanka, for example. And if you want to, if somebody wants to actually go and search for all these things, they'll just project it as something that is essentially Tamil, but they say that it's modern Tamil, but which is not.
Is there something that is essentially Bangalorean? I mean, my question, that's really the question I ask, because I think that very often this project that we have of seeing essentially XYZ in the past is kind of futile, because we don't have a complete picture of what the past was really like. And just as it's not possible today to choose an arbitrary set of factors and say that this is what defines an identity, I think it's even less possible to do that with people of the past. So, thank you for the intervention, sir. Yeah, yes, please, sir. Oh. Oh, okay. Okay. I'm a little worried, but please, sir. Do you want to come up here, sir? No? Okay. Can we have the temple image pulled up?
Can you please? Can you? Is it possible? Otherwise, forget it.
No, it's fine. It's fine.
Not this. Not this. Bradishwara temple in Tanjore.
Yeah, all the way back. I'll tell you when to stop.
It doesn't matter.
Back.
The temple is about 250 feet tall.
Okay. Stop.
That's okay.
Oops.
It's about 250 feet tall, and the globe on top of that weighs about 35 to 40 tons. And just imagine what effort would have gone into lifting it up there.
Yeah.
Away from Tanjore, I'm talking of this, the one on top here. And the measurements say that a minivan can stand on top of it, make one round on top of that, which is a fact. This is Tanjore. 8 kilometers away from Tanjore, there's a place called Sharapallam. Shara means ramp. Shara means a ramp. So they made a ramp 8 kilometers away from this place, and then the globe there on top, it was rolled up all the way. Just imagine what scaffolding they must have had during those days. Tremendous it is. That is one thing. If you are going to Tanjore, please visit this temple. It's one of the marvels. So don't miss it, and don't miss that. Second thing is that the shadow of this never falls on the ground.
So that's not true. You can stand in the shadow. That's why I made sure to put the shadow over there.
That's okay.
You can see the shadow.
Third one, as you enter the temple complex, straight away is the lingam, the main temple there. You go around it to the northwestern corner. There is a Subramanya temple there. I'm not sure who built it, but it's there.
It's a Nayaka period temple, sir.
Possibly Nayaka period. There's a panel about 8 inches wide. It goes all around the temple, and you've got holes made in that, and just a needle goes into that hole, and the distance between one hole and the next is just a finger, the little finger distance. At a little finger distance, you have holes made, which is about 8 inches down, and nothing more than a needle goes. Sometimes you try the coconut rind. You have a coconut leaf, take the rind, and then try to push it. Some part of it goes, others doesn't go at all. Imagine the whole thing around it has these type of holes. They did not have drilling machines those days. We don't know how they made it. And if you made 100 of them, you are given 100 of them, you make 98, and then the 99th breaks the plate, then you'll have to make the whole thing again. Tremendous job they have done. So it's worth seeing that. Please go to this place. I have one question for him.
Yes, sir. We're waiting. Please tell us.
Kulothunga Cholan, otherwise called the Chalukya Cholan.
Yes.
So because he is from the Chalukya dynasty,
Yeah.
how did they accept him?
How did they accept him? So, I don't want to give you guys all the answers because I want some of you to buy the book at the end of this whole talk. So please read chapter 4. I get into this in a whole lot of detail. So thank you very much. Thank you for sharing your love for this temple. Yes, ma'am. But the gentleman
yes.
first.
Thank you for demythifying history, Anirudh. My question is about the naval power that Cholas is supposed to have had. You seem to have a different opinion that they never had the naval power, and it is mainly the merchant navy that took them to Southeast Asia. But then there are 2-3 issues. One, when they invaded Sri Lanka, they did it with the naval power. And then number 2, they have also invaded the Munitivu, Panirairam, there's a present Maldives. And without a naval force, they would not have achieved that. And then Rajaraja defeated Cheras at Kandalur because Chera naval power was the most, powerful naval power around that time. So this was also would not have been possible without a naval power. And the present Andaman Nicobar Islands, it used to be called Nakavaram. They had a naval base, supposed to be having a naval base in Nakavaram. And without, that's their first target. Through that naval force, they have entered Southeast Asia. And K. Nilakanta Sastri also mentions this Chera, conquering Chera with a naval force at Kandalur.
What a great audience we have today. Thank you, sir. Thank you. But I think that all of these ideas that you have put up are not based on concrete evidence. Nilakanta Shastri said them based on one particular reading of Chola inscriptions 100 years ago, and they're not based on any archaeological work. There is no evidence, whether linguistically, genetically, or archaeologically, of a Chola presence in Nakavaram. The thing is that we have this evidence in Sumatra. We know that when a medieval state set up an outpost, there are all these various ways in which you can find evidence of it. You will find evidence of urbanization. You will find, especially with Tamil outposts, you find temple building. There is no evidence of this in Nicobar. The idea that Nakavaram is Nicobar comes from the linguistic similarity. But you would expect to find evidence of a base there which does not exist. Point 1. The second point about the Maldives. Rajaraja Chola claims the conquest of the 10,000 islands of the ancient sea. This is what he claims. Now, I told you the example of what he claims in Anuradhapura versus what the archaeology tells us. Where is the archaeological evidence of the Chola conquest of the Maldives? Why would they have need to conquer the Maldives in the first place? Because you would find, once again, you would find evidence. You would find gold coins there. There are no Chola coins there. If it had been conquered, it would have been used as a mercantile outpost. There's no evidence of that. Once again, you have that in Sumatra. Finally, as far as the Chera navy is concerned, we have Rajaraja claiming that he cut the vessel in the hall of Kandalur, and this has been interpreted in many ways by many different scholars. So, for example, Emmanuel Francis of the French Institute of Pondicherry thinks that this is a whole mistranslation. He thinks that Rajaraja fed through the vessel in the hall of Kandalur. Yes. The another interpretation, and once again, cutting the vessel could either mean the destruction of a navy, but was the navy destroyed at sea? Was the navy destroyed while it was in port? It's impossible to say, but once again, why do we think this could only have been done through a state navy? Now, keep in mind, on the Brihadishwara temple, you're talking about Rajaraja Chola's claims, right? On the Brihadishwara temple, you have extensive documentation of his conquests. You have individual army regiments that give their names and say, we have made such and such gift to the temple. Where are the navy regiments? Where are the navy captains? You have Senapatis making so many gifts across Tamil Nadu. Where are the naval officers? And the thing is, I'm not setting out to necessarily, I'm not setting out, my agenda is not to destroy myths. My agenda is simply to point out what are the facts. And my goal is to insist that we not force medieval states to fit into the mold of present states. Today's states have bureaucracies, today's states have armies, today's states have administrations, they have navies. I don't think this was always the case for medieval states. I think that states are constantly changing and evolving as the world changes, right? Once you keep that in mind, once we just simply allow medieval states to be different from ours, then you have a much more interesting society. Because here's the thing, which other medieval society had merchants as ambassadors? I can't think of any instances in any Chinese record where they say that a king sent a merchant as an ambassador. You look at the merchant inscriptions in Tamil Nadu, they tell you that these are warrior merchants, these are fighting merchants. These are not just merchants who are sitting and counting coins. They are recruiting people. Sometimes you see merchants who are serving as Chola officers. You see them making gifts to temples. You can see them administering Chola temple grants. So there is something new and different happening here. There is a very interesting alliance between merchant and state. There's a blurring of the line between merchant and courtier and warrior. And as long as we insist that the Cholas had a navy, we are blinded to this much more interesting picture of a society. Now, if archaeological evidence is found of a Chola navy, I would be delighted, because it will change our whole understanding of how the Indian Ocean world operated. But until that day, I would just like to insist that we allow medieval people to be different from us. I hope that answers your objections. Thank you, sir. Yes, ma'am.
So mine is not at all scholarly.
Sure, ma'am, okay.
So, I mean, I'm sure you've read Ponniyin Selvan.
Yes.
And Sembian Mahadevi comes across as this almost ascetic lady, you know. I mean, there is a power struggle between her son and Raja Chola.
Yeah, yeah.
She actually doesn't want her son to become the ruler, and, you know, her son is a ruler for a very short time, right?
Yeah, or 12, 13 years, yeah.
Whereas I haven't read your book, and one reason I'm going to read your book is because you say Sembian Mahadevi is a rock star.
Yes.
So how do you reconcile these two images? I mean, in one book she's almost like a sannyasini. You know?
Yeah.
She's so detached.
Well, Kalki Krishnamurti is writing based on the scholarship of 100 years prior. And if you, for example, Gauri Ramnarayan, who is his granddaughter and translator, has talked about why did Kalki depict his figures in particular ways. And Kalki's objective, he is a nation builder, he's a freedom fighter. He wants to depict these people of the past as role models for how politicians and activists should be today. So he is quite clear that he is writing historical fiction. But I am quite clear that I am writing history. I am giving you the facts, I am giving you the inscriptions, and I am telling you the picture that emerges as of a remarkable medieval lady. This woman is perhaps the most important woman in religious history anywhere on the planet. And I'm not even exaggerating here. So, thank you. Exactly. Yes. Yes, it's okay.
Anirudh, over here. So, a pretty small question. So, why is the spotlight even in Tamil Nadu usually on Cholas and not on Pandyas and Pallavas and Cheras, though they were magnificent, you know, if not as much as Cholas? And the follow-up to this is, like, how did this obsession with Cholas arise? Do you think Kalki's Ponniyin Selvan played a role where, you know, an entire generation was catapulted into that?
I think you guys want to get me into trouble or something, huh? What is up with these questions, sir? I think that the polities we choose to remember, the history we choose to remember, says a lot more about who we are than who the people of the past really were, right? It's quite baffling if you have to look at if you think of V.O. Chidambaram Pillai, who set up Swadeshi Steam, the first Indian steamship company. When he's inaugurating the company in, I think, 1902, he gives a speech. You would expect him to call back the great naval conquest of the Cholas, but he doesn't, because they've been forgotten by the time. Today, the naval conquest tours are very important because we're like, India, man. You know? We don't want these small we want big empires. That's what we want. So, I think that's where it comes from. It comes from a modern political need. We want history to fill us with pride. We don't want history to teach us how societies change. So I hope that answers your question. Thanks.
This might be a little bit of a controversial question.
Oh God, yet another one. Okay, great.
Yeah. So I think we've seen today that you've told us today that temples were much more than just places of worship. That they were centers of economy, centers of political power.
Yeah.
So how would you put that in context with the temple destruction debate? So especially with how we were told us that temples were destroyed by the Cholas, of the Chalukya, Western Chalukya. So how would you say we need to rethink the temple destruction debate in terms of the role that temples played in medieval India?
Well, I think we tend to think of medieval armies as being these very disciplined entities that execute the will of the king. And we assume that the king's motivations are can be boiled down to a single thing. But I don't think it's possible to do that even with ourselves. How many of us can say that we do things for a single clear motivation? All of us are complex people responding to many different things. And this was the case for medieval people as well. And when even modern armies can be accused of human rights violations, and these are professionally trained armies that in principle adhere to a code of conduct, to international laws about what is permissible in warfare. When modern armies don't do that, how do you think medieval armies functioned, right? I think that in keeping the focus merely on one kind of site, we lose track of the bigger picture of how violence changes societies. When wars happen, people die. Cities are evacuated, harvests are disrupted, famines ensue. In our focus merely on what is happening to the royals and the structures that the royals built, we are forgetting that wars were terrible things. That the very fact that individuals could wave a sword and order bands of young men to loot and pillage and rape is horrible. We are a society that has moved past that, and we moved past that with great difficulty. Yet today, the actions of some individuals 1,000 years ago are used as a justification for equipping and arming young men and letting them do whatever they want yet again. And I think that this is what happens when the past is thought of only as some place that needs to teach us some kind of emotive lesson to feed some kind of modern political need, is that it will be weaponized. And the more that we can talk about the people of the past as people, the more we can understand the horrible sacrifices that needed to be done, not just a few generations ago, to build checks and balances, to hold the powerful accountable, the less willing we'll be to dispense of all of this in the name of suturing some past wound. And can you guys please stop getting into trouble with these questions? Like, is this going to be recorded? Is this going to be put up somewhere? Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, I have a question.
Oh, no, yes, sir.
One assumes that the kings, emperors lived around the temples or around the temple towns. Has there been any archaeological evidence that about the palaces or the castles, if you have to use the word, or even of the towns or cities or the way the people lived over there? Now, lately in the 20th century, we've excavated the Indus Valley civilization. And has there been anything like this about the Cholas? Because it's all about the temples.
So it's happening. In Gangaikonda Cholapuram, we have found what appears to be a Chola palace. It is being excavated as we speak. And it shows us a pretty expansive brick compound with facilities for running water and pipes and drains and whatnot. But we're still at a very preliminary stage in the investigations. The big problem with medieval archaeology, especially in India, is that a lot of the big medieval towns are now big modern towns. So you can't kick people out of their homes to answer a question about how medieval people lived, But there are some cities that are yet to be discovered, and hopefully I'll have more answers for you in a few years, but I'll leave it mysterious.
Just before we proceed, so because time constraints, we'll be taking 3 more questions, and then we have a bookstall installed outside. You can go purchase the book, and we'll be having a sign session with Anirudh. So just wanted to let you know.
Okay, and after all these questions, I'm going to expect a whole lot of people coming up for signed copies. Understood?
Hi, Anirudh. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. Tell me.
One of the things that we read in the caste system, especially, is the Kshatriya and Brahmins being above the merchant guild, at least in the Varna system, I guess. But seeing a lot of history that's being discussed, especially these days, the Jain merchants in the late Mughal East India Company times. Then you had mentioned in the Lords of Deccan as well, the 500 of the Aihole, and then the Tamil Merchant Guild. I mean, as as much as things change, they stay the same. Economic forces and access to capital decides who stays in power a lot of the times. So where do you think that's, I mean, it makes pretty much sense that any strong king would have a lot of access to capital. But why is this Varna system or the caste hierarchy or the societal hierarchy thing, it still exists to this day? It's still looked upon downwards a little bit.
Well, why does it exist is a different question from how it actually worked in the past. I think that today we tend to think of the past of India's history the way the British thought about it. The British had particular ideas that they developed from readings of particular texts that they think are most important, and they applied this willy-nilly to all of Indian history. But of course, this is not an accurate picture of how the past really was. When you look at the literary evidence, you see that it's really a much more complex society where there's a lot of push and pull. It is not, no medieval state is capable of giving an order and having it trickle all the way down to the bottom of a social pyramid. You instead have a system where many powerful people are struggling in the middle. They are trying to go up and they're trying to push down. And as they're doing that, they're adopting various behaviors that are associated with power. Very often these are caste purity ideas. For example, eating particular kinds of food, maintaining contact with particular kinds of people. But it is not a top-down process. It is very often, and what is very interesting is that very often it's when states are declining, when there is a need for some kind of, for the middle powers to kind of establish themselves in society, that you begin to see caste appearing quite a lot in Tamil Nadu. So the Valangai and Idangai divisions of Tamil society, here's the interesting thing about the caste system. In Tamil Nadu, instead of it being purely a top-down system, you also have a horizontal division. And the fascinating thing about the Valangai and Idangai is that you first hear about them in the context of the Chola army. You hear about the Valangai Mahasenai, the great army of the right hand. And very interestingly, you hear about it in South Karnataka as well. These guys are pretty active here. And it seems that as the empire is declining, all these various organizational, occupational groups that were once part of the army are rekindling these old ties that they had and saying, we are going to act like sons of the same house who belong to the same parents, and anybody who acts against one of us acts against all of us. And they agree that we are all the right-hand caste, we are all the left-hand caste. And you have many cases where these guys go to war straight out. So in the 15th century especially, they have pretty acrimonious relations. But in the process, you begin to see the increasing differentiation of society. In the beginning of the Chola period, you have a very diverse set of people making gifts to temples. You have even shepherds and washer people making gifts. By the 13th century, it's increasingly becoming landed castes for making gifts. By the 15th century, it's the artisan caste because of Indian Ocean trade. So those of you who have seen the textile exhibition here will know what I'm talking about, but you should go and check it out because the textile trade changed the social history of South India. But I'm starting to get tired now, guys. I'm going to be honest. You guys are really asking me these really intense, long-winded questions. 2 more short questions, please.
Yeah, I'll go ahead. Hi. Okay, so hi, I'm here.
Hello.
Hi. My question is on what happens to trade after the decline of the Cholas. Now, do we have evidence of these merchant sort of armies or even these merchant warriors, say, changing their allegiance as the Chola Empire declines, or what really happens to the economic structure? Because the trade continues, I'm assuming. It doesn't stop with the decline of the Cholas. So what happens there?
Well, trade grows. It begins to accelerate, oddly enough. But it kind of makes sense once you think about it. The less governmental control you have, the less tax that is being extracted, the more profits that can be made, so the more people are going to get into trade. So you see in the 15th century, and this is a time when the Vijayanagara Empire, you guys have been to Hampi, Vijayanagara, Vijayanagara. So Vijayanagara conquers the Tamil coast. And these guys are up in the Deccan. They are like, just do whatever, just make sure you give us our tribute. So what happens is that weavers become very, very powerful in South India. And you have many inscriptions where Vijayanagara officers say that we have hereby given the weavers permission to enter into the temple and to make gifts to the temple. And here's another one of those crazy stories of like how a society can change. There is a caste called the Kaikolar, who are weavers, and Kaikolar means strong arms. The earliest mention we have of Kaikolar is as Chola bodyguards. So it seems that as the empire is declining, these guys who are well in touch with court fashion and who have strong muscular arms become weavers. And while initially they're not super important, well after the decline, the disappearance of the house that brought them up in the world, they themselves become temple patrons. And very interestingly, the Kaikolar have a long-lasting relationship with temples through the Devaradiyar or the Devadasi system. So there's in many Kaikolar families would give their girls to temples. And where does all of this come from? It comes from this empire that appeared from nowhere, disappeared. But to me, it is such an interesting story of how history is never over. Just because a dynasty has disappeared doesn't mean that the world is not going to carry on its way. It doesn't mean that society isn't going to evolve. And it doesn't mean that oppression can't happen. And I think that's something that we should always keep in mind when we're thinking about the past. So, thank you. Great question.
We have one last question.
Yes.
Hi. So I had a question. So R.C. Muzumdar has written this book on where he uses the word colonization. So do you kind of agree with that? And a sub question to that is from personal experience, right? Like if you go to Da Nang in Vietnam, you see this temple which is in South Indian style in Maison by the Cham Rajas. So what is like the connection between say the Cham Raja and was it like the temple built by the sea? Do you know anything about it?
I will have to see the temple.
Okay.
But very often, I have to be perfectly honest. I think that we think we know a lot more about temple architecture than we actually do. Because we are relying only on the buildings that survive, which are the buildings that are made in stone. We don't know about the wooden buildings. We don't know about the transmission of ideas on diagrams, on wood, on cloth, on earth, on stone. We don't really know how architectural ideas are being transmitted. So whether there's a South Indian temple or not, I can't tell you without seeing an image of it.
There is actually, I mean, you can look it up. You can find pictures on the internet. There are actually Indian
What is South Indian about it?
Sorry?
What is South Indian about it?
The gods, for example, the idols, the motifs that we saw in like similar to like Chola, you see like not gopurams, but because the temples are much smaller, but you see the idols are very similar. You see the kind of vestiges or the iconography that you see in South Indian temples. And
I would have to see it. I will say that, look, preliminarily, I have to be skeptical. That is the scholarly way to approach it. But it's possible that there were Indian settlements in Vietnam. Again, we've seen evidence of them in Sumatra. There's no reason why they couldn't have been in Vietnam. It's perfectly possible. And the interesting thing about the Tamil diaspora is that wherever they go, they build a Tamil style temple.
Yeah.
So it's possible that there was a settlement, but without seeing it, I can't be certain. Now, this question of colonies. Majumdar's idea, and keep in mind, Majumdar is writing in the 20th century, early 20th century, when India is a colonized country. So, not just Majumdar, but even Nilakanta Shastri, and a whole bunch of historians who call themselves the Greater India Society, given the evidence of their time, they are trying to find a proud and expansive Indian nation. So they say that these are colonies that were established by force, or these are colonies where culturally superior Indians taught culturally inferior Southeast Asians. This is the way that people in the 20th century thought about states.
Kind of adding themselves to the hierarchy in some sense.
Yeah, exactly. So this is the way that the British thought about states, for example. They are these culturally superior, martially virile folks who came and taught the racially inferior Indians. I don't think this archaeological evidence supports this. I think that what we're seeing is a much more complex picture of exchange. And definitely because India was the more urbanized place, it is definitely where the first impulse comes from, but it's not where the last impulse comes from. We know, for example, of the famous Buddhist teacher Atisha Dipankara, who was a Bengali Buddhist master who took Buddhism to Tibet, right? But Atisha Dipankara finished his studies in Suvarnadvipa. He got his accreditation as a master from a Sumatran master before taking this idea to Tibet. So clearly, while you can still make the case, I think, in the 5th century that yes, here you have the Gupta Empire in North India, clearly some political ideas are being disseminated into Southeast Asia. We forget how quickly urbanization can happen sometimes. We've seen how the Chola state goes from one tiny kingdom in 30 years to a superpower. And I think the same thing happens in Southeast Asia, is that once these ideas of state and ritual and polity take root, very quickly you have new kingdoms in Southeast Asia that are very ambitious and capable of moving very large amounts of resources. The scale of Borobudur is extremely impressive. In the 8th century, there is no freestanding stone structure that is as complex as Borobudur. You have the Kailashnatha temple in Ellora, but that's rock cut. Now, don't get me started on the Kailashnatha temple because I'll go on about for half an hour. But on that note, you've been such a great audience. Thank you for your fantastic. I'm so impressed you all sat through all of my answers. Thank you. Thank you all.